It's time for us to check back in with Dory, Woman of the Mountains, and see what happens next. If you've missed any of the previous readings, you can look in the description below for a playlist. Fred knew he wasn't prepared to work at many good-paying jobs. He detested the cotton mills. Whatever he did had to be outdoors. Electric power was a new and promising development. Eventually it would reach every corner of the country. He answered an advertisement for a correspondence course on electricity, and pamphlets came painting a glowing picture of the future of electricity. Fred became a student of the Cone's Electrical School of Chicago. After a full day's work on the skidder, he'd spend hours studying at night. I came to know what burning the midnight oil meant. Some of the math problems were more advanced than his 9th grade education. When he came to a problem he couldn't solve, he took his books and went to see Newt Claybo, my teacher from the Glades and now bookkeeper for the lumber company. Newt worked with him until he understood and worked out the problem. One of his assignments required him to build a generator for electricity. The school sent him some parts, but we had to make do with some homemade ones too. One of his assignments required him to build a generator for electricity. The school sent him some parts, but we had to make do with some homemade ones too. He built a trough to carry the water to a wheel, which turned the generator and made electricity. The school had sent 2 electric light bulbs. Fred ran wires to the middle of the kitchen and sitting room. The naked bulbs hung limp from the ceiling. "Don't touch the bulbs until I get back," Fred said. He went outside and started the generator. "Now just watch when I snap this switch." Suddenly the whole room was filled with a clear, steady light, many times brighter than the kerosene lamp. It was a miracle. Electricity had come to the Smokies. People came to see our bright lights, which seemed to come from nowhere. How could a little machine and a few wires create such perfect light? Time slipped by. Fred got a letter from his mother reminding him she hadn't seen him in 3 or 4 years. She begged him to come home. We didn't have enough money for train tickets for all of us, so we decided that he should go. The children and I would stay at home in Stringtown. When he came back, he had a crystal radio set. He had traded his most prized possession, a camera, for it. His brothers-in-law, Horace and Wade Abbey, were very enthusiastic about this new invention. Fred wanted us to hear for ourselves. We took turns listening to music from Nashville on the headphones. The music was faint and laced with the squeaks and squawks of static. It was magic to us because it was a link to the outside world. Rumor became fact. The Little River Lumber Company lands were sold to the government. The company still had cutting rights for 15 years, so we wouldn't be affected soon. However, we made long-range plans to leave the mountains. Nothing changed on the surface, but we knew how the loggers felt about moving out and looking for work. Many of these people had lived their lives in the shadows of the mountain peaks. Generations of ancestors had lived and died here. Now their descendants were displaced citizens with no claim on the land. Eventually, they would all have to go. 5 good years were spent here. We'd lived in Stringtown longer than any place since we'd married. Charles would be 5 years old, and my second family was about to begin. On Wednesday, November 9th, 1927, William Wayne was born. As usual, Dr. Bruce Montgomery was there with all his bluster, and as usual, he did nothing to relieve my discomfort. Nature was left to take its course. We hadn't had a baby in the family in so long that Wilma and Edith made a toy out of the curly-haired boy. When the school day was over at Lynn Camp, they'd rush home, each demanding it was my day to play with the baby. Lynn Camp School was one of the best we'd had. The children eagerly grabbed a lunch pail filled with biscuits, meat and jelly, or apple butter, and walked to school. Paul still had to be watched to be sure he didn't memorize his reader instead of learning to read word for word. His ability to memorize anything he heard was astounding. Stringtown was a fisherman's paradise. Men had contests to see who could catch the biggest fish, and no fish was wasted. When we could, we had them for 3 meals a day. Orville Ormby won the prize without a doubt. He caught a trout so big it practically filled a washtub. He was camp celebrity for some time. Ma could still catch more fish than most men, but she never came near Orville's record-sized trout. The children loved Stringtown more than any place we'd lived. When they were grown men, Paul and Charles went back and found the rock where they had played. Holes tediously drilled by two small boys were still in the rock. Christmases came and went. We still didn't have Christmas trees at home, but the company always had a big one for the school party. I bought dolls for the girls and trains for the boys. Ma always gave us enough material for 2 dresses for each girl and overalls for the boys. Santa Claus was not part of our celebration. The children knew the gifts were bought with hard-earned money and that they didn't just appear miraculously in a stocking or under a tree. When we left Stringtown, Fred sold the electrical equipment to Creed Spurgeon, who later moved it to Cosby, built his own mill wheel, and became the first man to have electricity there. Once again, we were using kerosene lamps with their soft, flickering glow. In early January 1928, we moved house and all higher into the mountains to Mark's Cove just below Clingman's Dome. This was the highest peak belonging to Little River Lumber Company. It was the most beautiful place we lived. Just across the Tennessee-North Carolina line above us, the Norwood Lumber Company had burned completely in 1925, and the site had been abandoned. We were the only people for many miles around. Our house was the last one at the end of the line toward Clingman's Dome. The company built an extra room on the back of our house so that we could keep boarders. As always, there were more workers than housing. 4 men moved in. I only cooked for them. They took care of their own bedding and clothing. I never knew what they did with their spare time. Every chance they got, they went back down to Tremont where there was more interesting things to do. A cold crystal spring ran from the mountain in front of our house. An iron pipe was implanted in the spring, and water ran constantly into a big galvanized tub. The sun came up in front of the house. While the sky was still dark, silvery streaks appeared over the mountaintops. Later, the sun rose slowly, majestically, through trees covered with hoarfrost and ice. Each icy tree caught the sunlight and gave back rainbows of color. Fred worked when the weather permitted. It was so cold the loggers had to keep a fire burning in the machine boilers all the time. The temperature was 28 below zero on several occasions. During a hard freeze, the water line to one of the skidders froze and burst. The noise echoed through the mountains like exploding dynamite. When I went to milk in the morning, ice formed on the collar of my coat where I breathed. We had to take special care of the cattle. They could survive the cold during the day, but had to have warm stalls at night. One neighbor lost his milk cow. She had gotten out during the night and froze to death. The loss of a cow was devastating. The milk and butter were essential to family health, and usually there was no money to replace her. A pot-bellied stove kept the one-room school warm on average days, but when the cold wind howled outside, the heat could only be felt if you were very close. Lessons were forgotten as the children huddled around it to keep warm. There were about 20 children in school. They still drank from one dipper and out of one water bucket. When colds and epidemics came, I took my children out of school. The cemetery at Marks Creek is full of small graves, children who died of pneumonia, croup, and diseases brought in from the outside. Red measles could kill and did. Unless someone brought in an infectious disease, we stayed well. On a cold Saturday morning, Fred said he was going to Elkmont to get shoes for all the children. He got a birch stick and measured each small foot, cutting a notch in the stick where each foot reached. He put on his Mackinaw coat, a cap with furry ear flaps, and his work boots. The trip would have to be made on foot. He would be traveling logging trails and trying to go straight as the crow flies to get to Elkmont and back before midnight. All day the children looked for him to return. I kept telling them it was much too soon to expect him back. Darkness came early with the short winter days. Wind howled through the trees and rattled the windows. I was anxious to have him home, but I kept reassuring the children. It was almost 9 o'clock when the wind blew him and the snow through the front door. We all rushed towards him. "Whoa," he said, "I feel like sugar covered with ants." A big brown package was strapped to his back. He had taken his belt and a piece of string and tied the bundle on his back. He needed his hands free to climb the snow-covered trails using 2 short poles for balance. Wilma and Edith must have been dreaming of shoes like Cinderella's, or at least shiny patent leather slippers. What they got were high-topped brown shoes and long olive-green stockings to keep them warm. Disappointment showed in their faces, but they knew he'd done what he thought best. They would be warm and practical for the cold walk to school. Dreams don't always come true. What we want and what we need are 2 different things. A hard lesson to learn when you're young. As often happens after severe winter, spring came early. Fred screened in the porch, and we spent most of our time on it. Edith loved to get up early and watch the sun slip up and over the mountains. The robins were coming back, and wildflowers covered the forest floor. "Mom, I just saw the most beautiful thing in the world," she said one morning. "What was it?" "There was a robin singing in the very top of a tree. The sun behind him made him look like he was framed with gold." As the old saying goes, we counted our chickens before they were hatched. Spring seemed so certain and well established that we were completely surprised when snow started falling in May. It started as dainty flurries in the afternoon, but by dusk it had taken on the appearance of a full-grown blizzard. When the wind stopped and morning came, we had several feet of snow. It was no work and all play the rest of the day. We made snow cream by filling glasses with snow, adding sugar, vanilla, and milk, and stirring. During the warm months, we would go to visit Pa and Ma in Stringtown. Luther and Fred hunted while I heard all the news from Ma and Lola. Ma had many relatives on the job and kept up with all of them. If we wanted to know anything about them, all we had to do was ask her. She always knew who was getting married, who was having babies, and where they were working in the mountains. Sometime in July, Fred's brothers, Harry and Bob, come looking for work. We put 2 more bunks in with our boarders. I later learned their real purpose for coming. Bob, especially, couldn't abide hillbillies, so I should have been suspicious from the start. Their father had sent them to persuade Fred to come back to North Carolina and get rich raising chickens. Everything was settled except for one small detail. Fred hadn't the courage to tell me about the business adventure. He was going to have everything ready and simply tell me we were moving. How wrong he was. I wasn't going back to North Carolina. Many letters went back and forth between Mr. Cope and his sons. Fred never told me what was going on, but I noticed that the letters were always torn to shreds after the 3 of them had read them. Curiosity rose like yeast inside me. I had to know what was going on. One day they were working high on the mountain and would be late getting home. As fate would have it, a letter arrived from North Carolina. I couldn't stay away from it. Countless times I picked it up and quickly put it back down. When the supper was cooking on the stove and great white clouds of steam rose from the pots, a wicked idea completely overcame my better judgment. I picked up the letter and held it in the steam. Slowly the flap loosened and curled back. I slipped out the letter and read about the master plan. Once I knew the plan, my strategy was simple. Fred really couldn't keep a secret, and since I knew what to fish for, he didn't have a chance. I sealed the letter back up and set the flat iron over it to press out the telltale creases. When they came in that night, they took the letter and went outside to read it. I watched Bob tear it to shreds and go toward the outhouse to get rid of it. As I expected, Fred told me everything when I confronted him. They were amazed I had discovered their plan. It never occurred to them that I had read the letter. It was in perfect shape when they opened it, and it was never out of their hands after it was opened. Very calmly and firmly, I told Fred if he went to North Carolina to raise chickens, he'd go without me. He must have believed me because he gave up without a struggle. Harry and Bob suddenly decided they could find work on the other side of the mountain. We were all unhappy when the orders came to leave Mark's Cove. God's handiwork had reached perfection here. The crystal spring water ran icy cold in the hot summer. The trees reached high toward heaven. The rhododendron and mountain laurel grew thick and beautiful under the rocky overhangs. Ferns, moss, and an assortment of wildflowers carpeted the ground we walked on. Birds sang lullabies, and squirrels barked out warnings to invaders infringing on their territory. Sometimes at night we'd hear the spine-chilling scream of a panther or wildcat. Now in my later years, this is the place that appears most often in my dreams. I can feel the good, cold water in my mouth and the pure, crisp air in my lungs. The lumber company was being very selective in cutting trees now. Certain standards had to be met before one was cut. A new policy had been put into effect when the land was sold to the government. Instead of scalping the mountain, only the biggest and best trees were taken. As a result, our jobs were for shorter periods of time. We spent less time away from the central locations of Tremont and Elkmont. With more free time, the men had more time to think up devilish pranks to play on each other. A tale began to circulate about a haunted cabin on one of the hollows near Tremont. The tales became more frightening as they went along. After a few Saturday night swallows of white lightning, men became brave knights ready to take on any foe, seen or unseen. To make the undertaking more interesting, they collected $50 to give to the man who would stay one night in the haunted cabin. The timekeeper, Punch-Out, Gilland, was the volunteer. He went inside and the men stretched out on the ground around the cabin to be sure he stayed all night. Everything was quiet until about 1 in the morning. Punch-Out burst out the front door, running at top speed toward the camp with all the men in pursuit. He disappeared into his own house for the rest of the night. In the morning, he wouldn't talk about what had happened or what he'd seen. There were no more takers for the $50 jackpot. In early spring of 1929, we moved to Sam's Creek, about a mile above Tremont. The children were going to school in Tremont, where Eula Fox Broom taught. Her husband, Shirley Broom, was a train engineer for the company. With her help, the school had begun to build a small library. This had been a problem in all the schools. To be sure my children, as well as Fred and I, had books, I ordered 1 or 2 every time an order was sent to Sears and Roebuck. We had almost all of Zane Grey's novels and Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan books. Zane Grey's Betty Zane had been read so many times that the covers were pasted and patched together. Jean Stratton Porter held us captive with her tales of the Limberlost, a dismal swamp in Indiana. We had Freckles, a girl of the Limberlost, the Harvester, Laddie and her father's daughter, Keeper of the Bees, and the Song of the Cardinal. Grace Livingston Hill was a favorite author among the women in camp. She wrote romantic novels. We borrowed and exchanged books with all our friends and relatives. I had read to all the children long before they were old enough to understand what I was reading to them. Fred usually bought a Sunday newspaper. The children and I took turns reading the funny paper aloud. For the first time in many years, we didn't have boarders to feed. The children and I were free to walk in the woods, play in the streams, or just daydream. Life for me was drastically different from the way Ma's had been. We bought what we wanted from the company store or ordered from Sears and Montgomery Ward. We still canned and preserved our food, but I never had to weave anything to wear. My children never gave me much trouble. I felt as young and free-spirited as they acted. In truth, I had started my family when I was so young, I felt I had grown up with them. On the weekend, we sometimes went to the movies in Tremont. The children begged to go since this was a new, fascinating form of entertainment for them. Charles, 7 at the time, never seemed to understand they weren't real. In one movie, a train broke loose and ran wildly down the track, seemingly coming towards us. Closer and closer it appeared on the screen. Charles watched in horror, screamed, and hid under the seat. His movie watching was over for a while. The school board got every film they could beg or borrow. One came from the country agricultural department. This film would give you an idea how much we wanted entertainment and enlightenment. It was a whole story showing the destructiveness of the corn borer. The villain was a farmer named Jones who wouldn't listen to the pleading of the agricultural department to burn his corn stalks, infected by the borer. All his neighbors did as they were told, but not Farmer Jones. He let his corn grow and harvested what he could. Ah, but he had trouble. One morning he got up and found holes everywhere. His wife stepped off the back porch and disappeared down a hole. His barn had holes. His house had holes. It seemed the corn borer was no longer interested in corn, but in everything on his farm. The last scene showed Farmer Jones awakening from his nightmare and dutifully burning his corn and the horrible borer. Since there was no real pasture land and not much to eat, our cattle roamed free in the camp. There were no fences anywhere. Trains would stop for cattle on the tracks. New Ormby had a big black bull that thought the whole territory belonged to him. He'd come to our house and run the children inside. After they came into the house, he'd paw around and butt at the timber supporting our back porch, causing the house to shake. I felt sure he'd send the house tumbling down the mountain if the post came loose. We had no defense against him. The children played with caution outside, always aware that he'd be upon them before they could get out of his way. On his next visit, I had a surprise waiting for him. I saw him charge into the yard, snorting and pawing. All the children seemed to come through the door at the same time. As usual, our porch post was his next target. He was so angry and aggressive that his onslaught caused the dishes to rattle on the shelves. I took the kettle of boiling water off the stove, slipped quietly out onto the back porch, leaned over the railing, and poured the steaming water all over him. He bellowed and went charging up the mountain. He never came back to bother us. Sometimes he'd stand across the tracks and look at our house. I often wondered what he was thinking. Heavy thunderstorms had started early in the spring. Strong winds battered the mountainsides but never reached tornado strength here. After one hard storm, the children went out to play. Minutes later, they were back inside begging me to come and see what was outside. They had found tiny frogs all over the ground. The frogs were so small they looked like spiders hopping around. We decided it must have rained frogs. Probably a wind funnel had sucked them up from a pond or river and had released them in the storm over the mountains. Ma had told us an old English legend about a tree that grew fish. They found that the wind had blown them to the tree and it didn't grow them at all. That surely was the reason it rained frogs. For a long time the children looked for frogs every time it rained. We never saw them again. I don't know if the warm, heavy rains were the cause, but the loggers were having more trouble than usual with snakes this summer. Copperheads and rattlers were everywhere. One day the saw ripped through a partially dead tree, and when it fell, the men counted 22 copperheads cut in half. During a heavy rain on a cool morning, Fred took cover under a hanging rock. Noticing what he thought was a pile of sticks and leaves, he reached down for a stick and drew back his hand in horror. He was standing beside a pile of copperheads. The cold weather had made them sluggish, or he would have been bitten. 26 snakes were taken from the pile. A few days later, he reached under a log to fasten a chain around it. When the log was lifted high, a 4-foot copperhead dangled from the bottom. He'd put the chain around the snake, too. Pa kept a record of the snakes in his time book. Before the summer was over, the crew had killed 354 snakes, copperheads, and rattlers. Bears were a problem too. Several cows had been killed and pigs carried off. One family found their cow with part of its hindquarters eaten away, but somehow it was still alive. Of course, it had to be killed. A full-grown bear standing upright could carry a pig in its front paws, cradled like a baby in its mother's arms. The men in camp planned to hunt and kill as many bears as they could find. Paul went to Pa's to borrow a rifle for the hunt and was gone longer than we thought he should be. Fred started up the railroad to see if there was any trouble. Just as he was passing a high bank on his left, something jumped off the bank and landed at his feet, missing him by inches. He held the light high in front of him. Just steps away, a black panther lay panting. He stepped back to get some distance from it, then he ran like the wind. Apparently, the panther had jumped at him and missed. It struck the railroad tracks, addling itself. Looking back, he saw the black form stumbling toward the river. The next morning, we all went to look for tracks. Panther tracks as big as my hand went down the bank to the water. Nature seemed determined to cause trouble on this job. Several small earthquakes rumbled under our feet, just enough to make us nervous and watchful. In late July, a heavier quake shook the mountains. Our back bedroom broke loose from the rest of the house. We were outside in seconds. Panic kept us up all night. The children sat big-eyed and silent in the dimly lit room. We were not in the mood for games or small talk. Soon after the children started to school in September, Fred was caught in the worst accident of his logging career. I saw 4 men coming toward the house carrying a limp body. When someone was hurt on the job, he was taken to the nearest house to care for and wait for Dr. Montgomery if the injury was bad. It wasn't until they were almost in the house that I knew it was Fred. His pants legs were torn and blood oozed from the blue, puffy blotches below his knees. The skin was scraped from his cheek and down one arm. We were not sure which bones were broken or how many. Impatience had been his undoing. The crew had been working the same section for several hours. The skidder had hauled many logs from the side of the mountain, and the pile was high. They decided to go for one more load. The skidder operator pulled the burden of logs upon the side of the pile and had backed off on the cable so the chokers could be unlocked. Looking around for the choker expert and not seeing him, Fred decided to do it himself. He climbed up the pile and had unhooked about half of the chokers when the logs began to slide. Fred lost his balance and fell into the log pile. He lay sprawled across a large log. The choker cable with the log still attached was across both his legs. He lay hanging head down from the top of the pile, while the cable crushed his legs with the weight of a huge log pulling on the other end. Alan Sizemore quickly saw the problem. He picked up a double-bit axe and in one stroke cut the cable. Free from the burden of the log, the cable whipped and curled upward, unpinning Fred, who tumbled down the side of the pile. It was a miracle that his legs were not broken, but much damage was done to the muscles. Before it was over, the massive bruises turned almost every color of the rainbow. It was many weeks before he could work again. He didn't get any pay while he was off, and again our meager savings were used up. While he was getting well, he studied books about electricity. Besides working for the lumber company, Alan Sizemore was a Baptist preacher. He and his co-workers kept us fed while Fred's leg mended. They brought in boxes of food until Fred's salary was started again. Another fascinating peek into the life of Dory. So many interesting things in this part of the book, just like in every part that we've read so far. I like the part in the beginning that Fred needed to work outside. He couldn't stand being in those mills. It reminds me of my husband Matt. He likes to be outside and work. He don't like to be cooped up inside. He has to be a lot of the time working in different buildings that the county manages, but he's always glad when whatever project they're working on is outside. I was really fascinated by Fred studying the electricity and then even making the power there at their house. That is really interesting. I have a video that I will link to if you didn't see it about where Don Cassida took me on a trip to visit some of the home places in the Smoky Mountains National Park. And one of the sites that we visit is where someone had built a power house. So they had power. They had a water wheel like what Dory's describing, but on a bigger scale than this. I think you have to watch the video, but I think that it powered maybe more than one house. But I think that's so fascinating because other parts of the country, I'm sure, but I can only speak to Appalachia, but other parts of western North Carolina for sure did not have power at that early time. So I always think that's fascinating to think that a place like here in Wilson Holler didn't have power to well beyond that point, and then there was places in those rugged Smoky Mountains that actually had electricity. You can just feel the excitement of the kids when Fred walked that long walk to Elkmont to get their shoes. Even though they were kind of disappointed, I'm sure that was a very exciting time for their daddy to go and bring home stuff from the store. Also exciting for them to get that radio. Like Dory said, that was like bringing the outside world into their world there isolated where they were at. And the sudden May storm, the snowstorm, the blizzard. I remember one time when I was still living in Haywood County and I was working at Lake Logan. It was May, maybe the first 2 weeks of May, something like that. I can't remember the exact date, but it started snow. It come a big snow, probably 8 inches, and it was this big, wet, heavy snow. And you could just hear trees outside. I would go outside there where I worked, and because it was so forested, you could just hear trees snapping under the weight of that, because a lot of them had leafed out. They had leaves on them, and it was a big snow. I remember that Matt come. I was afraid to drive, so he was going to come get me, but then once he got there, he said it's such a wet snow, the roads are it's not slick, so he convinced me to follow him back. So I followed him back to Canton, and it was a really short-lived snow. It didn't last long. Maybe by the end of that day it was gone, or certainly by the next morning, but it was a big, big snow for May, you know, when you think about snowing in May, so I liked that part. I thought the chicken scheme was funny, and funny that Dory figured out how to figure out what was going on. Of course, she was suspicious with them tearing up the letters and dropping them in the outhouse, you know. She wanted to know what that was about, but it's funny how she thought to steam open the letter and then read it, and then of course convinced Fred, said, well, you might go back to North Carolina, but I'm not going back. So I liked that part. That part, Dory acting like that, kind of reminded me of Dory's ma, so she did get a little bit of that stubbornness from her. Of course, I loved all the visual things that Dory talked about. The place that was just, she said that was God's creation in perfection. Wouldn't you have loved to have been there every day and seen the beautiful sun and the crystal waters and the sunrise and the sunset every day? I would have loved that. I loved the little frogs, getting to see something unusual such as that. That was really interesting part. All the things that she describes all through it is just fascinating, even down to the cows wandering around. Now, I would have been afraid of the bull. I would have been afraid of all the cows if I was a little kid, because they're big, but especially that bull. But Dory again, seems like something her mother would do. She fixed his little red wagon, as we would say, and run him off for good from her house. So I enjoyed all parts of this part of the book, just like I have the entire book. But I really love the one little line. You can see Dory's wisdom, where she says, she's talking about what you want and what you need, talking about the shoes that Wilma and Edith, they wanted kind of the fancier, nicer shoes than what their daddy brought. But they knew, and she was saying as they got older, they would certainly learn it even more, that piece of wisdom, that a lot of the times what you want and what you need are two different things. So I like that part, that little part of wisdom there. It is so true, and it's hard to understand when you're young. It's hard to understand when you're not young sometimes, but the older I get, I find that I find it a little bit easier to understand and to realize that so many of our wants are just that, just wants. They're not the needs. They're not what we need to get us through each day living here in this old world. So I hope you'll leave a comment and let me know what you enjoyed about this part of the book. And as always, I hope you'll drop back by next Friday, because we've got to see what happens next. You can kind of hear these hints of, you know, the logging's coming to a close, and Fred studying for electricity and all that. So we've got to see, though, what happens next. So do please drop back by next Friday to see what happens next with Dory, Woman of the Mountains.